Before you sign that contract, Mr. Blake, you may want to translate page 52 again. Emily Carter said it so calmly that Jonathan Blake needed a second to understand why every conversation in the private dining room had stopped. Less than 30 seconds earlier, the billionaire had been smiling. Now his fingers rested motionless beside a black coffee cup, and the polished Swiss watch on his wrist might as well have stopped with them. Across the white tablecloth, French investor Laurent Dubois slowly lowered his glass. Daniel Foster, Jonathan's chief strategy officer of 14 years, did something even smaller. He looked at Emily, not with surprise, with concern. Emily noticed. She noticed everything. At 28, she had spent enough evenings carrying plates through expensive rooms to recognize the moment powerful people realized someone they had overlooked had been listening. Her white shirt was crisp. Her black apron was neatly tied. A silver serving tray rested against one hand. Nothing about her appearance suggested she belonged in a $400 million acquisition discussion. Jonathan had made that assumption himself. Minutes earlier, while Emily replaced the coffee service, he had switched casually into French and made a joke to Laurent about her. She has been standing beside this table all evening, Jonathan had said, amused. Perhaps by midnight she will believe she understands international finance. Laurent had not laughed immediately. Daniel had. Emily had continued pouring coffee. Jonathan glanced at her and added, still in French, do not worry. People hear what their position allows them to hear. That was when Emily set down the coffee pot. She turned toward him. Her expression remained composed. Then she answered in flawless French. Positions determine where people stand, Mr. Blake. They do not determine what they understand. Jonathan's smile disappeared. Lawrence's eyebrows lifted. Daniel stopped laughing. Emily could have left it there. One clean correction. One uncomfortable silence. Enough to remind a billionaire that a black apron was not proof of ignorance. But she had heard something earlier that evening. Something more important than an insult. So she continued in English. Your French is not the problem, Mr. Blake. The translation on page 52 is. Jonathan looked toward the thick acquisition agreement near his right hand. What are you talking about? Daniel answered before Emily could. She probably heard part of our discussion and misunderstood it. Emily's eyes moved toward him. Daniel smiled, but there was effort behind it now. This agreement has been reviewed by attorneys in New York and Paris, he continued. There is nothing for you to worry about. He had addressed Jonathan, yet his eyes remained on Emily. That was the second thing she noticed. Jonathan leaned back. He was 43, founder and chief executive officer of Blake Meridian Group, and he had built his reputation on recognizing weakness before anyone else in the room. Tonight, however, the person making him uneasy was not the investor across the table. It was the waitress standing 3 feet away. What exactly do you think is wrong with page 52? He asked. Emily did not touch the contract. The percentage in the English summary is not the percentage Mr. Foster described to Mr. Dubois in French. Laurent turned slowly toward Daniel. Jonathan's expression sharpened. What percentage? Emily held his gaze. You were told 24. Daniel's jaw tightened. Jonathan, this is ridiculous. Emily remained still. Mr. Dubois was told 34. Silence returned. This time nobody looked at Emily's apron. Jonathan reached for the agreement. Daniel's hand moved toward the same folder, then stopped. Emily saw that too. 6 hours earlier, none of these men had known her name. By the end of the night, they would understand that the most dangerous person to underestimate was often the one nobody had bothered to notice. 6 hours earlier, Emily Carter was standing beside the service station at Maison Laurent, watching steam disappear from a cup of coffee she already knew she would forget to drink. It was shortly after 2 in the afternoon, long before Manhattan's dinner crowd would fill the restaurant, and the dining room belonged to the quiet rituals that guests never saw. White tablecloths were being pressed smooth. Crystal glasses caught the pale October light coming through the tall windows. Silverware waited in perfect lines. Emily tied her black apron securely around her waist and lifted a wine glass toward the light, searching for fingerprints. At 28, she had become very good at noticing small things. A water glass running low. A guest searching for a server without raising a hand. A hesitation before someone ordered the least expensive item on the menu. Most people thought good service meant moving quickly. Emily knew it meant paying attention. Private room tonight. Her floor manager, Rachel Morgan, said as she approached with the reservation sheet. Blake Meridian Group. 6 guests. 7:30. Emily lowered the glass. She recognized the company immediately, but gave no reaction. Any special requests? Black coffee for Jonathan Blake. Sparkling water. French wine list. They are meeting investors from Paris. Rachel glanced toward the private room. Important dinner. Emily smiled faintly. They are all important dinners when you are carrying the plates. Rachel laughed and walked away. Emily returned to polishing the glass. Near 4 o'clock, a white American couple in their 60s arrived early for drinks. The husband unfolded a French newspaper while his wife quietly asked him in French whether they had left their theater tickets at the hotel. Emily heard every word as she placed water on their table. "Thank you," the woman said in English. "Of course," Emily replied, giving no indication she had understood the conversation. There was no reason to. 20 minutes later, Emily collected 2 menus from the bar and noticed a missing accent mark in the name of a French wine region. She took a pencil from her apron, corrected it, and returned the menus to their stack. One of the bartenders noticed. "Since when are you the French department?" he asked. Emily smiled. "Since somebody printed it wrong." She moved on before he could ask another question. During a brief lull before dinner service, she finally reached for her coffee. Cold. Again. She drank 1 sip anyway and noticed a financial magazine abandoned near the lounge. The cover mentioned European infrastructure acquisitions. Emily opened it while waiting for clean silverware. Her eyes moved quickly across an article discussing cross-border holding companies, disclosure requirements, and intermediary ownership. She had read halfway down the second page when Rachel called her name. Emily folded the magazine and set it aside. "Your private party moved up," Rachel said. "Mr. Blake will be here at 7:15. Emily checked the clock. "I will be ready." By 7, Maison Laurent had transformed. Chandeliers glowed above crowded tables. Conversations blended with the soft sound of glasses and silverware. Emily moved through the room with practiced calm, carrying 3 plates on one arm and remembering for separate drink orders without writing them down. At 7:13, the front doors opened. Jonathan Blake entered first. Charcoal suit, white shirt, dark hair perfectly arranged. His eyes went immediately to the Swiss watch on his wrist. Daniel Foster walked beside him carrying a leather folder thick with documents. Emily passed 10 feet away with a tray of sparkling water. Jonathan never looked at her. Daniel did, but only long enough to make sure she would not cross his path. Emily continued toward table 12. As she passed behind them, she heard Daniel say one sentence. "Once Du Bois signs tonight, the European structure is locked." Emily kept walking. She had no reason to remember those words. Not yet. Jonathan Blake entered the private dining room at 7:16 with the controlled impatience of a man who considered every unnecessary minute an expense. He placed his phone beside the nearest setting, removed his charcoal jacket only long enough for the attendant to hang it, then checked his Swiss watch before taking his seat. Daniel Foster laid the leather folder on the table and opened it immediately. "Laurent is 6 minutes away," Daniel said. His attorneys accepted the revised structure this afternoon. Jonathan reached for the black coffee Emily had placed beside him. "Accepted or stopped objecting?" Daniel smiled. "Tonight, those mean the same thing." "They never mean the same thing." Emily was arranging sparkling water near the far end of the table when Jonathan said it. His tone was quiet, but there was precision underneath it. She glanced toward him without turning her head. Jonathan Blake was not careless. That mattered. Men who missed details because they were careless were easy to understand. Men who noticed everything except certain people were different. Emily approached with the wine list. "Mr. Blake, would you like the Bordeaux selected for the table, or would you prefer to review the list?" Jonathan looked at the list, not at her. "The Bordeaux. Certainly. And keep the coffee coming." "Of course." She stepped away. Daniel waited until the door closed behind her. "You could let someone else make one decision tonight." Jonathan opened the acquisition summary. "I did. I let you choose the restaurant." At 7:22, Laurent Du Bois arrived with 2 advisors. Jonathan stood immediately. The greeting was warm but measured. the kind between men who respected each other without confusing respect with trust. Laurent was 56, silver-haired, and deliberate in every movement. He greeted Jonathan in English, then switched naturally into French when Daniel mentioned Paris. Jonathan followed the exchange with ease. His French was polished, though less fluid than Laurent's. Emily returned with the wine as the conversation shifted toward the acquisition. She poured without interrupting. The total consideration remains $400 million, Jonathan said. No changes after tonight. Laurent nodded. Agreed, provided the European allocation reflects what Daniel discussed with my team. Jonathan looked at Daniel. 24% through the intermediary structure. Daniel answered immediately. Exactly. Emily moved to Laurent's glass. His advisor leaned toward Daniel and asked something quietly in French about regulatory reporting. Daniel responded in the same language. The final structure gives us more flexibility than the English summary suggests. Emily's hand remained steady. Laurent frowned. Jonathan approved that. Jonathan approved the structure, Daniel replied. The wording was careful. Emily noticed. Jonathan was reading a page and did not look up. Dinner arrived. 4. The next 30 minutes. Business moved between English and French as easily as the plates moved across the table. Jonathan questioned revenue projections, tax exposure, and closing dates. He remembered figures without notes. He challenged assumptions before Laurent finished explaining them. Emily understood why people trusted him with billions of dollars. She also began to understand his blind spot. When Laurent spoke, Jonathan listened. When Daniel spoke, Jonathan listened more closely. When an advisor spoke, Jonathan asked questions. When Emily refilled his coffee, he moved his cup toward her without interrupting his sentence. He was not openly rude. In some ways, that made the distinction clearer. Jonathan divided the room by relevance, and Emily existed below the line. At 7:54, Daniel opened the thicker agreement. Laurent leaned toward him. And the final European percentage? He asked in French. Daniel glanced briefly at Jonathan, who was answering a message on his phone. Then Daniel replied, also in French. 34% once the secondary allocation is included. Emily was placing a clean glass beside him. She heard the number clearly. 34. Her eyes moved toward Jonathan's summary. 24% was printed near the top of the page. 10 percentage points had appeared somewhere between English and French. Emily finished setting down the glass. She said nothing, but this time, she remembered every word. Emily carried the empty dinner plates into the service corridor and placed them carefully on the waiting cart. 34%. The number followed her through the swinging door. She reached for the coffee pot, then stopped. Jonathan had said 24%. Daniel had confirmed it in English. Less than 10 minutes later, with Jonathan distracted by his phone, Daniel had given Laurent a different number in French. Emily knew enough to understand that a 10-point difference in a $400 million transaction was not a harmless detail. What she did not know was why. She returned to the private room with fresh coffee. Jonathan was questioning Laurent about expansion costs while Daniel turned pages in the acquisition. Agreement. European reporting remains consolidated under Blake Meridian? Jonathan asked. Yes, Daniel said. Laurent looked toward him, with the agreed flexibility. Jonathan glanced up. What flexibility? Daniel answered smoothly. Administrative discretion. Nothing economic. Emily poured Jonathan's coffee. Laurent studied Daniel for a moment, then said something in French. That is not how your team explained the secondary allocation. Daniel's eyes flicked toward Emily. She lowered the coffee pot as though she had heard nothing. We can clarify that later, he replied in French. Jonathan caught enough of the exchange to look between them. If something needs clarification, clarify it now. Daniel switched back to English. Laurent is concerned about reporting language. Legal already handled it. Jonathan nodded, but not completely. Emily saw the hesitation. Then Daniel changed the subject. He asked about dessert. The shift was almost elegant. Almost. Emily distributed menus. Jonathan barely opened his before pushing it aside. No dessert for me. Laurent smiled. Americans always rush the ending. Jonathan answered in French. Only when we already know how it ends. Emily stood beside the table collecting an unused spoon. Daniel laughed. Jonathan glanced toward her, perhaps noticing for the first time that she had remained unusually quiet throughout several French exchanges. "What about you?" he asked in English. Emily looked up. "Sir, you have been listening to French all evening." His expression carried mild amusement. "Do you understand any of it?" Daniel looked at her immediately. Emily noticed that before she noticed Jonathan's smile. "Enough," she said. Jonathan turned toward Laurent and continued in French. "That usually means someone remembers how to order coffee from a high school class." Laurent gave a restrained smile. "Perhaps." Jonathan looked back at Emily, then added in French, "She has been standing beside this table all evening. By midnight, she may believe she understands international finance." Daniel laughed more openly. Emily continued gathering the silverware. Jonathan should have stopped there. Instead, confidence made him careless. "Do not worry," he said to Laurent in French. "People hear what their position allows them to hear." Emily's hand became still around the coffee pot. Not tight, not trembling, simply still. The room continued around her for one quiet second. She had heard remarks like that before, usually disguised as humor, always protected by the assumption that the person being discussed could not answer. She placed the coffee pot on the table. Then she looked directly at Jonathan. "Positions determine where people stand, Mr. Blake," she said in fluent French. "They do not determine what they understand." Jonathan's smile vanished. Laurent slowly lowered his menu. Daniel stopped laughing. Emily's pronunciation carried none of the hesitation Jonathan expected. No searching for vocabulary. No classroom rhythm. Just calm, natural French. Laurent studied her with sudden interest. "Where did you learn to speak like that?" he asked in French. Emily met his gaze. "A long way from this dining room." Then she looked back at Jonathan. She could have walked away. The correction was already complete. But Daniel's expression had changed. He was not embarrassed. He was worried. Emily remembered the two percentages. 24, 34. She glanced at the acquisition agreement beneath his hand. Whatever had just happened between a billionaire and a waitress was no longer the most important conversation in the room. Jonathan did not speak for several seconds. He had spent most of his adult life in rooms where hesitation was interpreted as weakness, yet now he seemed willing to let the silence remain. His eyes stayed on Emily, not on her apron, not on the coffee pot, on her. Laurent was the first to break the quiet. "Your French is not merely fluent," he said in French. "You understand the rhythm." Emily gave a small nod. "Language is easier when you listen before you speak." Jonathan understood the answer well enough to recognize what it implied. "And apparently I did the opposite," he said in English. Emily did not rescue him from the discomfort. "Apparently." Laurent almost smiled. Daniel did not. His fingers rested against the edge of the acquisition agreement, and Emily saw him slide the document slightly closer to himself. It was barely an inch. Still, she noticed. Jonathan noticed her noticing. "Where did you learn French?" he asked. "France." "Where?" "Lyon." "University?" Emily paused. "Partly." Daniel leaned back. "Jonathan, perhaps we can save the biography for after the closing." His tone was light, but the interruption was too quick. Jonathan turned toward him. "We have time. Laurent has an early flight. Then we should finish." Daniel opened the summary sheet instead of the full agreement. "Exactly. The economics are straightforward." Emily looked down at the printed page near Jonathan. 24%. The number was still there. She could hear Daniel's earlier French sentence just as clearly as when he had spoken it. 34% once the secondary allocation is included. Jonathan reached for his coffee. "Emily." "Yes, Mr. Blake?" "You have been standing near this table for most of the evening." Daniel's expression tightened. "Jonathan." Jonathan ignored him. "Did you hear something besides my unfortunate attempt at humor?" Emily could have answered immediately. Instead, she chose her words carefully. "I heard two different percentages." Daniel gave a short laugh. "There are dozens of percentages in an acquisition agreement. These referred to the same European allocation." His smile faded. "You cannot know that." Emily met his eyes. "You used the phrase secondary allocation." Laurent turned toward Daniel. Jonathan slowly set down his cup. "What percentage did you hear?" Emily answered. 24% in English. 34% in French. Daniel shook his head. "She is confusing the base allocation with the post-closing structure." Emily said nothing for a moment. Then she looked toward Laurent. When Mr. Foster said 34%, did you understand him to mean a separate post-closing calculation? Laurent considered the question. No, Daniel leaned forward. Laurent, we discussed several scenarios. We did, Laurent replied. But that statement was not hypothetical. Jonathan's attention shifted fully to Daniel. The room had changed again. 10 minutes earlier, Emily had been invisible to the conversation. Now the conversation was waiting for her. 34% of what? Jonathan asked. Daniel answered quickly. The European holding structure. But the difference is temporary and economically neutral. Then why is my summary 24? Because the summary reflects the approved allocation. And the other 10? Daniel hesitated. Emily watched his hand move across the agreement, covering the lower corner of one page. A page number disappeared beneath his fingers. Jonathan followed her gaze. Move your hand, he said. Daniel looked at him. What? Your hand. Slowly, Daniel lifted it. Emily saw the number printed at the bottom. 52. Jonathan saw it too. Daniel closed the agreement. This is getting ridiculous. Emily's voice remained quiet. Maybe. Jonathan looked at her. Maybe what? She placed the coffee pot gently on the table. Maybe I misunderstood everything. Daniel exhaled as if the matter were settled. Then Emily continued. But if I did, page 52 should prove it. Daniel's expression changed before Jonathan even reached for the contract. And that was when Emily knew the difference between 24 and 34 was not a translation mistake. Jonathan pulled the agreement toward himself, but Daniel placed his palm on the cover before he could open it. Before we turn a complicated transaction into a courtroom drama over one sentence, let me explain the structure. Jonathan looked at Daniel's hand. Then explain why you closed the document. Daniel removed it. Because we are wasting time. Jonathan's eyes dropped briefly to his Swiss watch. Emily noticed the familiar gesture, but this time he did not seem impatient with her. He seemed impatient with uncertainty. Page 52, he said. Daniel opened the agreement himself and began turning pages. 48, 49, 50. His movements were controlled, almost casual. Emily watched from beside the coffee service. She knew this was the moment when staying silent would be easier. She also knew what she had heard. At page 51, Daniel stopped. The next section is standard intermediary language. Then there is no reason not to read it, Jonathan said. Daniel turned the page. Dense paragraphs filled the paper. Jonathan leaned forward. Laurent adjusted his glasses. Emily remained several feet away. Here, Daniel said, pointing to a paragraph. 24% of the acquisition consideration moves through the European holding structure. Exactly what I told you. Jonathan read it. For a moment, nothing happened. Daniel relaxed slightly. Then Laurent spoke in French. That is not the clause we discussed. Daniel's expression tightened. It is the same economic arrangement. Laurent reached toward the lower half of the page. No, the secondary allocation is here. Jonathan followed his finger. Beneath the primary clause sat another provision, smaller and more technical. He read silently. Emily saw his eyes stop. An additional 10%, he said. Daniel nodded quickly. Temporary. It returns after closing conditions are satisfied. Returns from where? An intermediary entity. Which entity? Daniel hesitated. A European special purpose company. Jonathan looked up. Name. Volmir Holdings. Emily felt the name settle into place. Earlier, while clearing the first course, she had heard Daniel mention Volmir in French. At the time, it had sounded like one more company among dozens. Now she remembered the exact sentence. She looked toward Laurent. Mr. Dubois, may I ask you something? Daniel turned sharply. This is not appropriate. Jonathan raised a hand. Let her ask. Emily addressed Laurent in French. When Mr. Foster described Volmir earlier, did he say the additional allocation would return automatically after closing? Laurent's face became thoughtful. No, what did he say? Daniel interrupted. Laurent, be careful. We discussed multiple structures. Laurent ignored him. He said Volmir would retain management control until a later transfer was approved. Jonathan looked at Daniel. Approved by whom? Daniel's answer came slower. The managing members. Who are they? The ownership disclosure is in the appendix. Jonathan began turning pages. Daniel leaned back, his confidence thinning. Emily could have stopped there, but another memory surfaced. The financial magazine. She had read before dinner. Cross-border holding companies. Intermediary ownership. Disclosure requirements. Volmir was not familiar, but the structure was. Mr. Blake, she said, if the additional 10% is economically neutral, there should be a clear beneficial ownership disclosure. Jonathan stopped turning pages and looked at her differently. How do you know that? The question carried no mockery now. Emily paused. Because French is not the only thing I studied. Daniel gave a strained laugh. She is a waitress, Jonathan. The words hung in the room. Emily looked down at her black apron, then back at him. Tonight, yes. Daniel frowned. What is that supposed to mean? Emily did not answer him. She looked at Jonathan instead. Find the ownership appendix. Jonathan turned another page. And if it is clean? Then I apologize, finish my shift, and bring everyone dessert. And if it is not? Emily's expression remained calm. Then the language was never the problem. Jonathan found the appendix. Daniel stopped smiling. Jonathan found the ownership appendix 3 pages later. For several seconds, the only sound in the private room was paper moving beneath his fingers. Daniel sat perfectly still. Laurent leaned forward, his expression no longer that of an investor negotiating terms, but of a man waiting for an explanation. Jonathan traced one line, then another. Volmir Holdings, he said. Registered in Luxembourg. Daniel nodded. Standard for this type of transaction. Beneficial ownership disclosed through Meridian Advisory Partners. Daniel answered too quickly. An administrative affiliate. Jonathan looked up. Affiliate of whom? A consulting group used by several European firms. Emily watched Daniel carefully. His voice remained controlled, but his right thumb kept pressing against the edge of the table. Jonathan turned another page. There is no individual ownership listed here, because the disclosure is incorporated by reference. Where? Daniel exhaled. Jonathan, this is exactly why attorneys review these documents. You are pulling isolated language from a structure that took months to negotiate. Then help me understand it. I have been helping you understand it for 14 years. There it was. Not an answer. A history. Daniel leaned back and finally looked toward Emily. And now we are questioning 14 years of judgment because a waitress overheard a few sentences in French. Jonathan's eyes moved to Emily. For the first time since the discrepancy surfaced, doubt returned to his face. It was small, but she saw it. 14 years against one evening. A senior executive against a woman carrying coffee. Familiarity against evidence that was not yet complete. Emily understood the calculation. She reached up and removed the small name tag pinned above her black apron. Emily Carter. She placed it beside the untouched dessert menu. Then do not believe the waitress, she said. Daniel gave a faint smile. Emily continued. Do not believe me because I speak French. Do not believe me because I notice the numbers. Read what is in front of you. Jonathan studied her. You seem very certain for someone who says she might be wrong. I am certain about what I heard. I am asking you to verify what it means. Laurent nodded slowly. That is reasonable. Daniel turned toward him. Laurent, you are encouraging this. I am encouraging transparency. Jonathan looked again at the appendix. Where is the incorporated disclosure? Daniel pointed toward a reference code near the bottom. Schedule C. Jonathan flipped toward the back. Emily remained silent now. She had done what she could. A few pages later, Jonathan stopped. Meridian Advisory Partners, he read. Managing member, Foster Strategic Consulting. The air seemed to leave the conversation. Jonathan looked up. Foster. Daniel's expression hardened. It is not what you think. Then tell me what to think. My brother established the firm years ago. I have no operational role. Jonathan looked back at the document. You disclosed that relationship? Not directly to you. To the board? Daniel hesitated. Legal was aware of the entity. That is not what I asked. Emily saw Jonathan's hand leave the page. He no longer looked confused. He looked disappointed. Daniel turned toward Emily again. This woman has no idea how these structures work. Emily met his gaze. You are right about one thing. He frowned. What? I am a waitress. She paused. But I was also 2 semesters away from completing a degree in international business. I studied French in college, spent 18 months in Lyon. and worked as a translation assistant for a trade consultancy before I came home to help my grandmother after she became ill. Nobody interrupted. Emily looked toward Jonathan. I did not stop understanding contracts because my life changed. Jonathan's expression shifted. The uniform had not changed. The woman inside it had not changed either. Only the amount he knew about her had. Daniel looked away first. Jonathan closed the appendix and placed both hands on the table. 14 years, he said quietly. Daniel nodded. Exactly. Jonathan's eyes stayed on him. Then you had 14 years to tell me who benefited from Volmir. Daniel stared at Jonathan across the table, but the confidence that had carried him through the evening was beginning to disappear. Nobody benefited improperly, he said. Foster Strategic Consulting receives an advisory fee. That relationship is disclosed in the schedule. Jonathan opened the document again. Disclosed where most people would never look. That is what schedules are for. And the additional 10%. Daniel hesitated. Temporary control for restructuring purposes. Laurent leaned forward. That is not how you described it to me. Daniel turned toward him. I described the commercial effect. You told me Volmir would retain management authority until the transfer was approved. Which is technically accurate. Approved by a managing member connected to your brother, Jonathan said. Daniel's face tightened. You are making this sound personal. Jonathan looked down at the contract. You made it personal when your family became part of the structure. Emily stood quietly beside the service station. She no longer needed to lead the conversation. The documents were doing that now. Jonathan picked up his phone and called Blake Meridian's general counsel. Michael, put an immediate hold on the Du Bois closing. No signatures, no transfers, and no amendments until independent counsel reviews Volmir Holdings, Meridian Advisory Partners, Foster Strategic Consulting, and every revision made to the European allocation. Daniel leaned forward. Jonathan, you are stopping a $400 million transaction over a disclosure issue that can be clarified tonight. Jonathan ended the call. No, I am stopping it because I do not yet know whether it is only a disclosure issue. The room became quiet. Daniel looked toward Laurent, searching for support. None came. Laurent folded his hands. My team will cooperate with the review. Jonathan nodded. Thank you. Then he turned back to Daniel. Until the review is complete, you are removed from this transaction. Daniel stared at him. After 14 years, Jonathan's expression remained controlled. 14 years is why I am verifying before I decide anything more. Daniel slowly gathered his phone but left the agreement on the table. Before leaving, he glanced at Emily. There was no triumph in her face. Somehow, that seemed to bother him more. The door closed behind him. Jonathan sat without speaking. The Swiss watch on his wrist caught the chandelier light, but he did not look at it. Laurent finally broke the silence. You should know something. Jonathan raised his eyes. Daniel told my team you personally approved the 34% structure. Jonathan's jaw tightened. I approved 24. That is what I understand now. Jonathan looked toward Emily. She had been right about the number, right about the language, right to question the appendix. Yet what seemed to trouble him most was not that she had noticed. It was that he had not. What else did you hear? He asked. The question carried none of the amusement from earlier. Emily thought carefully. He said the additional allocation gave your side flexibility. He said Volmir would hold management control. And when Mr. Du Bois asked whether you knew, Mr. Foster said you trusted his handling of the European structure. Jonathan lowered his gaze. Trust. The word sounded different now. Anything else? Nothing I can state with certainty. Laurent looked at her with quiet approval. Jonathan noticed the precision of her answer. She refused to turn suspicion into fact simply because the room was finally listening to her. You could have exaggerated, he said. Emily frowned slightly. Why would I? Most people would, once they realized they were right. She looked at the abandoned agreement. Being right about one thing does not make me right about everything. Jonathan leaned back. Hours earlier, he had measured competence by titles, offices, and proximity to power. Daniel had possessed all three. Emily had possessed none of them. Yet when the moment required judgment, she had done something Daniel had not. She had separated what she knew from what she only suspected. Jonathan glanced toward the black apron tied around her waist. Then he looked at her face. I owe you more than an apology. Emily shook her head gently. Start with the apology. Laurent smiled. Jonathan almost did. Fair enough. But Emily's shift was not over, and neither was the lesson Jonathan Blake had only begun to understand. By 9:18, the private dining room had lost the polished certainty it carried at the beginning of the evening. The acquisition agreement remained closed on the table. Laurent and his advisors had agreed to postpone every signature until independent counsel completed its review, then left Maison Laurent with quiet handshakes and no promises beyond cooperation. Daniel was gone. Jonathan remained behind for another 20 minutes, speaking with attorneys and board members while Emily returned to the work she had been hired to do. She cleared glasses, reset chairs, carried plates toward the kitchen. Nobody stopped her. That suited her. Near 10 o'clock, the last guests left the restaurant. The chandeliers dimmed. Manhattan continued shining beyond the tall windows, indifferent to contracts, titles, and expensive mistakes. Emily untied her apron long enough to straighten it, then returned to the service station. Her coffee was still there. She touched the cup and smiled faintly. Cold. Of course. You should probably stop making coffee you never drink. Jonathan's voice came from behind her. Emily turned. He stood several feet away with his jacket over one arm. Without Daniel, Laurent, attorneys, or a $400 million agreement surrounding him, he seemed less like the man who had entered the restaurant checking his watch and more like someone who had finally run out of reasons to hurry. Emily lifted the cup. I keep expecting one to stay warm. How is that working? Not well. Jonathan almost smiled. Then his expression became serious. I owe you an apology. Emily set the cup down. You mentioned that. I had not earned the chance to give it yet. She waited. Jonathan glanced toward the empty dining room. I mocked you because I assumed your job told me how much you knew. Then when you proved me wrong, I was surprised. He paused. That is the part one am ashamed of. I should not have needed proof before treating you with respect. Emily studied him quietly. You were not surprised that I spoke French. No. You were surprised that someone wearing an apron knew something you did not. Jonathan absorbed the distinction. That is worse. Yes. No anger. No satisfaction. Just honesty. He nodded. I am sorry, Emily. It was the first time he had used her name without needing to read it from her tag. Thank you, she said. Jonathan looked at the cold coffee again. You said you were 2 semesters from finishing your degree. I was. Do you want to finish it? Emily leaned lightly against the counter. Someday. And international business? I never stopped being interested in it. Jonathan reached into his jacket and removed a business card. He placed it on the counter between them. The number on the back goes directly to my office. Emily did not pick it up. Is this a job offer? No, her eyebrows rose slightly. That might be the smartest answer you have given tonight. Jonathan smiled. I thought about offering you one. Then I realized that would be another wealthy man meeting you once and deciding what your future should look like. Emily looked at the card. So what are you offering? An introduction. My company funds a return-to-school program with several universities. I can connect you with people who will evaluate your qualifications without owing me anything. And if I never call, then I learned something tonight. Anyway, Emily finally picked up the card and slipped it into her apron pocket. Jonathan turned toward the exit. Mr. Blake. He looked back. Your French was never the problem. He waited. Emily's voice remained gentle. You assumed the people beneath you could not understand you. Jonathan looked down at his Swiss watch, then slowly lowered his wrist without checking the time. I know. He left. Emily stood alone beside the service station. The coffee was cold. The restaurant was quiet. Her apron was still tied around her waist. Nothing about her value had changed since the afternoon. She had not become smarter because a billionaire listened. She had not become more capable because powerful people finally noticed. A uniform could tell someone what she did for a living. It could never tell them what she knew. And sometimes the quietest person in the room was not waiting to be given a voice. She was simply waiting for everyone else to learn how to listen